looking for, and you'll feel a little bit about
So we're back. First of all, thank all of you for a wonderful day yesterday. We had some good times in our group and at the reception. Saw the supermoon and everything. So I have the privilege of chairing today, and my first privilege out of many is to introduce Kars Alfrink from Leapfrog. It says he told me that I should call him an independent design consultant and educator, I guess. I started, when we were planning this conference, we decided that we really wanted a nice mix of practitioners and academics as speakers, both to fit into the different themes. So we had yesterday a focus on education, as you might have noticed. Today we have a focus on gamification and organization design, loosely defined. Playful design might also be a way of describing this. And I asked a very good friend of mine who knows everybody in the field of gamification and organizational design, and he gave me a long list, but Kars was at the very top of it. And luckily we could get Kars to come, and I started Googling him, and I found a lot of different stuff. So it was hard to figure out exactly what to say when introducing you, but I did find that you have a designer's profile on Board Game Geek, like I do. So that makes you a real game designer in my book. So welcome, we're glad to have you.
Thank you. Hi, good morning, everyone. I feel a bit out of place in this room, I have to admit. I have hardly any academic pedigree, so I've been practicing design for 15 plus years, and also doing research and teaching, but always kind of as this free agent type person. And nowadays, when people ask me what I do, I tell them that I mostly do design, and it's in the field broadly of emerging technologies, the built environment, and social progress. So it's really kind of pinned down, right? It's very clear. And in a previous life, so to say, I was a game designer and a reluctant entrepreneur. I ran my own boutique Playful design agency called Hubbub, together with a business partner, Alfrink, in Berlin. And this is me. And at Hubbub, we did all kinds of stuff, but it broadly slotted into one of two buckets. One is, so we did, as an agency, client services. And then we also managed to do our own self-funded, often independent projects. So here's a sample of what we did over the years. I founded Hubbub in 2009, and we went into hibernation by the end of 2015. We started out doing kind of social awareness street games, mostly. We also did a bunch of location-based games for museums, specifically aimed at families. So this was also about kind of play across generations. An example of some of the research we participated in at the Utrecht School of the Arts, we worked on a design concept for a game for pigs and humans called Pig Chase. We did kind of speculative video prototypes and later on also physical prototypes. I spent a lot of time playing with physical pigs in that project and learned a lot about play and playing with other species. Later on we sort of shifted away from games as such and got more interested in what I would describe as toys or playthings and that sort of thing. So these are some projects that were more about going back to kind of playing in the streets, playing in public space, but providing people with kind of newfangled toys that they could play with together, and less kind of aiming at at games. I also wrote, so that the kind of the city kind of figures quite heavily in a lot of the work that we did. So I also contributed to this book with a chapter on kind of the intersection of urban design and game design. But I was asked today to talk about two projects that we did in kind of the organizational culture change space. And these are, on the one hand, that's Code 4, which we created for the Dutch tax administration back in 2011. And later on, 2 years later, we created Ripple Effects for Royal Dutch Shell. So I'll describe these projects, and then I'll finish with some kind of thoughts on where I see these things going, or where I think they should be going. And then I hope there's kind of ample time for you to kind of just ask me questions, because I consider myself kind of a guinea pig almost, so you can use me to kind of ask whatever you want to know as a practitioner doing this kind of work for quite a while in industry. Okay, so both of these games are roughly made up of the same kind of components, or they follow the same blueprint with some interesting differences, which I'll go into in a minute. But the basic premise of both games was that for our player here, who is an employee of the organization, either the tax administration or Shell, the primary kind of vehicle for the game is a custom-built web application. And so they have their own account on this web application, they log into it, and they can do stuff. In both cases, players are part of a team, so they collaborate within a team. Each team member has their own account, and they have kind of this shared kind of space that they play in. So that's kind of collaborative play that's going on here. And there's actually quite a bit of the game. The point of the game is also that the coordination between these players is mostly left up to them. And I'll get back to that, why that's important. But then there's also other teams playing alongside this team. So where this is kind of collaborative play, here there's competition. In the case of Code 4, there's actually direct competition. So a number of teams are kind of occupying the same game space and kind of competing over resources. Whereas in Ripple Effect, actually we chose to kind of put a bit more distance between them. They can still see each other's scores, basically, so they can kind of compete on a leaderboard of some sort. But they are, when it comes to kind of the game resources, they are each playing their own kind of instantiation of a game. But then, so that's kind of something that could work in kind of a video game context, right? So you sit down for, I don't know, a session, play the game in this way. But what we actually chose to do is distribute this game in time, for one. So these games run over multiple weeks. This is a kind of a persistent game world that kind of ticks over in turns on a real-time clock. So players are provided with some time in the workday, which they can kind of use whenever they want to play. So they can just decide when, as part of their workday, they play, if they do that all in one session, if they spread it around. The same goes for all the kind of the offline interaction between players. But then there's also, and so because of this, non-players and kind of the company infrastructure, as I would call it, so all the kind of the hardware and the software that is provided to employees to do their work, is also at their disposal to play this game. And we kind of particularly in the case of Code 4, we designed this game in such a way that they would be encouraged to kind of appropriate things and also kind of play with or appropriate kind of social norms within the workplace towards game ends. And some of that stuff is quite visible. So there's also there's also some kind of interaction with these non-players, right? They know that their colleagues are playing this game, and there might some kind of arguments or kind of discussions might emerge, which are also part of kind of the learning effect that we are kind of striving for with these games. So we're trying to kind of insert this game into the kind of the larger company context, and in doing so, kind of shaking things up. And kind of creating some kind of space within which they can figure out other ways of playing, but also by extension other ways of working. Okay, this might all seem a bit abstract still, but I chose to do this so that you can kind of all the rest of the stuff that I'll be talking about fits into this framework. And like I said, there's some differences between the two games, but they follow this blueprint. So why were we asked to do these projects? So in both cases, the aim was, broadly speaking, kind of culture change. Both were kind of part of larger efforts within these organizations to change the organizational culture in some way. So in the case of the tax administration, there was this ongoing effort, mostly aimed towards kind of certain competencies of all the employees. Kind of that were arrived at through traditional kind of change management, kind of research consultancy that we were not part of. So we were brought in mainly because the organization felt that traditional change methods had not yielded the results that they were hoping for, and they were willing to try something else, and maybe a game might be that thing. Bear in mind, this was back in 2011, so we were at a slightly different point in kind of the discourse around this. These things were still considered very new, so it was quite a step actually for them to do this. For a ripple effect, this is a slide that I took from our concept deck, so this is also kind of giving you a sense of how we presented these things or how we developed these things. It was all about safety, unsurprisingly. For a company like Shell, safety is their kind of bears large in their company culture, larger even than I'd expected going in. They'd made great progress in kind of improving safety, and now they were kind of at kind of the final kind of percentages of kind of decreasing incidents and that sort of thing. And again, similar thing. They were looking to new or other means to achieve these effects, and so these were some of the things that we were trying to do here. This was mostly about those aspects of safety that are about kind of communicating across organizational boundaries, so to speak. And this image, if you are wondering, was from an anecdote that's a well-known anecdote about I think it was JFK visiting NASA and asking a cleaner what their job was at NASA, and the cleaner said, "My job is to put a man on the moon." And this is kind of this anecdote that's quite beloved of managers in particular. This kind of ideal, right, where there's this collective kind of sense of purpose, and so here's us kind of mirroring that anecdote that was told to us by management, right, and you know, deliberately putting that back in here as kind of this, because it is a nice metaphor for kind of the kind of feeling, spirit that you're trying to engender with this sort of stuff. Another interesting aspect of our work with Shell was that, whereas with the tax administration, the focus was very much on kind of people working together in one physical location. So they have a number of offices throughout the country, and we were we started out developing it in one office, and then we went on to kind of scale it out into other locations. So the whole game design was based on this premise that people would be able to find each other physically, right? Whereas in the case of Shell, of course, this is a globalized corporation, and any game that you do needs to kind of work within that context. So that led us to kind of de-emphasize the physical interactions and go fully kind of into kind of the virtual or the digital kind of collaborative spaces that a company like Shell uses to kind of have people work together. And here we were we were deliberately asked, on the one hand, to work with to connect people from the office and the front line. I find it so curious that they talk about front line. It's like this. I feel like I'm in the military, but these are the people who work on oil rigs, that sort of thing. Like where the resources are actually kind of extracted, right? So a word about the premise of each game. I talked about kind of the system in the abstract up to this point. Each game has this kind of has a particular kind of story that it kind of uses to draw players in and kind of have them make sense of what they're doing. So in the case of Code 4, it was quite speculative. So for the text administration, Code 4, the premise was that the country was thrown into this severe liquidity crisis. And so the administration would not be able to collect taxes in currency, and so this new department within this new effort within the tax administration was created called Code 4 that would collect taxes in goods, in physical goods. And so that's kind of the premise of the game. And then the players were also asked to then distribute these goods to public organizations, right? Because you kind of tax companies in this case in goods, and those goods need to go back to society to kind of keep the whole thing running. Whereas with Ripple Effect, the premise was much more naturalistic, and I think that also kind of maybe says something about the type of organization we're dealing with. We did suggest some more kind of speculative or kind of ridiculous kind of premises, which I kind of think is effective. But here the premise is simply that you are running an operation. This is much more like a game as simulation, right? Which is much more the traditional kind of serious gaming approach, or at least kind of the early serious gaming stuff was very much about this kind of, let's just simulate our business and then people can play that business simulation, but then they can get to kind of experiment with other ways of doing it, and then they'll learn something. I think there's something to be said for these more speculative premises, because they tend to provide people with a license to play, right? So they tend also to signal, by virtue of being slightly ridiculous in the case of Code 4, this taxing companies in goods and stuff. I mean, you guys may all be thinking, whatever, but if your job is to collect taxes and I tell you this story, you might actually get a bit kind of excited or interested that this is slightly weird, because that's the world you operate in on a daily basis. So the speculative framing kind of emphasizes this play, right? Whereas the naturalistic framing that we chose in Ripple Effect can kind of create certain expectations about the realism of the game systems and so on and so forth, which can be a problem. Because the type of stuff that we try to do is not do games as simulations, but kind of these more kind of, if they are simulations, they are subjective simulations, they are kind of trying to argue for a particular thing. Okay, so what does that look like? What do players do in these games? So in the case of Code 4, I'm just going to talk over this little promo reel. Like I said, the basic activity of the game is that there's this market simulated by the game, where you can kind of collect taxes and goods, and then there are companies, public organizations asking for particular things, so they have particular needs, and then you can kind of provide them with these goods. So you're kind of managing supply and demand. It's a trading game, basically. And again, this is kind of done as a team. So the team has shared resources, kind of like action points is a way to think about it. They have a finite amount of things that they can do over the course of a day, so they need to kind of decide among themselves what they do, and then they can do these things in real time. There's also this news feed that updates and that provides them with some information on how supply and demand may develop, so they can anticipate on things. And then so there's some interactions there as well, and this is something that's unique to Code 4 with actors coming into the company. And so the fiction of the game also kind of arrives sometimes in person, or through the paper mail system, or email, that sort of thing. So there's this, and this is a story about kind of an internal power struggle over the management of Code 4, and the people involved with it kind of embody different kind of values, and the players need to kind of figure out where they stand in those things. And finally, there's also some kind of physical rewards that you can get, so that you can actually get, if you do this supply and demand thing, in some cases, and that's kind of made transparent also in the market, in some cases, if you manage to do things well, you will get, if you're managing food, for example, you will actually get as a kind of a reward some actual physical kind of food that you can do with whatever you like. Right? So, and that's also so the actors and the physical rewards and these kinds of things make this game kind of give it some presence within on the work floor, and that actually worked out quite well. Yeah, so with ripple effect, like I said, the physical aspect had to be de-emphasized, because where in Code 4 teams were made up of people from different departments, so nobody was a direct colleague of each other, because we wanted to kind of break up existing relationships and kind of allow people for some kind of freedom to experiment maybe with a slightly different behavior, and it doesn't help if your direct teammate is your direct manager or whatever. The same applies to ripple effect, which the web app you see here behind me. So this is just a recording of me playing through some of the game's early turns. In the case of ripple effect, all the play is kind of remote. So players are part of a team, and they're globalized, right? So their teammates can be anywhere else in the world, and we had people in the Americas, Europe, Asia, all kind of part of the same team. So one interesting consequence of that is that we had to account for time differences in how this game ticks over again, right? So this really is a 24/7 game, whereas Code 4 went kind of dark. Well, not dark, but went dormant outside of the workday. So you could still do things, but none of the kind of crucial information would appear on the game website outside of the workday, because we did not want to kind of stress people into kind of feeling like they were forced to play outside of work hours. Whereas with ripple effect, it's much more, people need to be able to play like around the clock. So that's one thing that changed there. And so what do you do here? Again, it's the core of it is a resource management game. So we draw heavy inspiration from board game design for both games. Both games started out as kind of board game prototypes, which are kind of these resource management games. And here, well, like I mentioned, it's about getting resources, and safety is kind of the key challenge. So you can do, each player is given this kind of unique station, and each station has unique properties, and those properties are opaque. And so you spend resources to understand how safe your station is. You can spend resources to improve that safety. You also need to kind of figure out how productive, how effective your station is in producing stuff. and again, and you can improve the production as well. And then you can actually produce things, and depending on how safe your station is, when you produce resources, something bad might happen. And the whole point of the game is that you're dealing with incomplete information, so you're making kind of these risk assessments based on incomplete information, but you're using shared resources. So your team has a shared pool of resources, and each has their own stations. So some might be more safe, some might be less safe, some might be more productive, some might be less productive. And you need to kind of talk between your group about how these resources are most effectively kind of put to use, because your score is dependent on kind of your collective kind of resource production. And so the whole point of this game is to kind of set up a system where it's about kind of getting people to talk about these very basic concepts of safety and of kind of incomplete or imperfect information, and kind of making these kind of trade-offs, because what happens in kind of system safety is one of the big points of failure is actually a lack of kind of dialogue between kind of various kind of parts of the organization about these things. Okay, so learning, how do we think about learning as designers, basically, of these games? So one thing, as you will expect, is that our clients, of course, want to see that learning has actually happened, right? These games are non-trivial investments, so you need to kind of somehow show that something is happening. Setting aside kind of the long-term effects of these things, in the short term, one of the things that we did, particularly with Code 4 in this case, is that learning goals were kind of translated into observable behavior within the game. And we designed game events around those observable behaviors. And we built a system in the back end of the game where our puppet master, our game master, who's on the floor throughout the game, can log observed behaviors. And we have the benefit of these actors actually coming in and having these real-life encounters with players as well, and they could report back to us how those encounters went, right? And then we could use those to log particular game behavior. If all of this sounds slightly creepy to you, we also insisted on a Chinese wall between all the data we collected on players and the company and the organization. So there was no direct access by anyone in the organization to any of that game data. Another thing that I should mention is that all players, we also insisted that play was always on a voluntary basis. So this was not, neither of these games were rolled out in such a way that everybody had to kind of do it as part of some kind of, I don't know, assessment or whatever. That was, we made the point that you would not yield kind of the benefits of play if you would do that. So there's some kind of qualitative kind of observation of player behavior that we can do both physically, but also, of course, digitally. We can see players do things. And so for both games, we also collected quantitative data that was tracked per player, anonymized, of course. And we could use those to kind of provide kind of aggregate metrics about, okay, how's this game actually working out for groups of players. So that's kind of showing that some learning may have happened. Another thing that we try to do is kind of go one step further in terms of kind of taking responsibility for this kind of learning for individual players by helping them reflect on the game. I don't remember who it was yesterday who mentioned this, but we've also found in our own practice that simply providing a game that might lead to some kind of insights is not good enough, right? The reflection on the game experience is super important part of certainly of these types of experiences. So the thing we did as part of this package was that we worked with trainer coaches, and they would have these kind of one-on-one reflection sessions with players on their game experiences, and kind of talking about particularly how those experiences compare to their work life, and whether or not there might be any kind of things that they could take from this game experience into their day-to-day experience. And these again were confidential. There was strict confidentiality between these trainer coaches and the players. I think that's. I'm quite proud of us being able to do that, actually, as part of this project. We weren't able to do the same with Ripple Effect, if only for practical reasons, because we're operating at such a different scale, which is an interesting kind of thing, I think, when you consider that many of these companies are becoming kind of, all these companies are becoming globalized and thinking in terms of large scale and so on. So some of this kind of tends to get lost in the mix. But in the case of the tax administration, we had the opportunity to do it. So how are these things made? So at Hubbub, we work with very small cross-disciplinary teams. Here's part of the Ripple Effect team. Code4 team, the Ripple Effect team. As you can see, this was a while ago. I feel very old when I look at these pictures. One point that I would make about the way we worked on these projects is that these are, when I say cross-disciplinary, I don't just mean specialists sitting in the same room and kind of each doing their own thing, and then that all somehow comes together into this one product. We worked with people who straddle disciplines in all cases. So artists who can code, game designers who can do art, writers who can do game design, and so on and so forth. And we put a lot of effort in how we organized our stack, so all the tools that we used, so that all these people were, for the most part, working in the same material all the time. So we were directly contributing to the end product all the time, all of us. That requires some kind of a particular comfort level with technology from all of these people, but it allows us to kind of work at a high pace and experiment a lot from the very beginning. We started out in both projects with some field research, talking to players, getting a sense of, particularly in the case of Code4, the physical kind of game environment, because we knew we wanted to use the physical building and stuff, so we had to kind of get an understanding of how it worked. And also, so all these conversations kind of serve primarily as a way of getting inspired. Like I mentioned, these things always, in our case, start as physical prototypes. Those of you who make games yourself, this will probably be familiar to you. We practice iterative design, so it's very much kind of based on this continuous cycle of prototyping and playtesting, initially kind of in our own studio, eating our own dog food, and then going from taking physical prototypes to the client's location, playing with them, at some point kind of translating some of this stuff into digital stuff, all the way through until we deliver the final product. In both games, the narrative elements have served the function of a metaphor for improving the accessibility of what is actually, in both cases, quite an abstract economic game. And in the case of Code4, there was this additional layer, which was, so here's kind of the whole kind of game's storyline mapped out and game events and stuff. Kind of the fiction of the game, by virtue of these role-play encounters and these things that would arrive in your inbox or whatever, these kind of interactions with fictional game characters. The narrative and the fiction is also kind of this resource and this site of play on top of this resource, kind of this trading resource management game. And that allowed us to kind of, I guess, touch on some topics that are very hard to deal with in a purely kind of systems-oriented fashion, which is this trading game. We used kind of we used a visual style in both cases that was deliberately kind of taking a step away from what is common fare in video games. We did not want to kind of signal that this comes from video game culture. We chose to work with, in the case of Ripple Effect, for example, an artist and illustrator who primarily does editorial work. So we wanted to kind of convey a different aesthetic, basically. And it was our sense that this different aesthetic might make these games more approachable to a particular audience that would be put off by something that resembles things that their children might play, for example, which is in a corporate setting can be an issue. And so, like I mentioned in the introduction, we stopped running Hubbub roughly 2 years ago now, and Ripple Effect is 4 years old now. So I've been doing other things since. Some of it I showed in the introduction. But if I were to go back into this space, I think I would do a few things differently, so I'd like to share those with you. Where am I at now with this sort of stuff? And then there's time for questions. So one of the things I would do is get really serious about designing these things together with players. So getting representatives of players really kind of involved in the design process from the get-go, and make sure that they have a real say and a real stake in the outcome of the design process. Of course, we did involve players in these projects. I mean, the primary vehicle for this were playtests. You know, giving players a version of the game, letting them play it, observing how they get on, sitting down with them afterwards, having conversations about what worked, what didn't work, and then we would go back to the studio and try again, basically. But their actual influence, obviously, depended to some extent on our own goodwill, of course, and also on. But we were again then operating within the constraint of this client-agency relationship, right? Which brings with it its own kind of struggles. So I feel like there might be another way to set up these projects that would allow us to shift that balance somewhat more, at least, towards players, because I think there's kind of a disconnect between the values kind of espoused by these games, which are about play, collaboration, you know, some kind of egalitarian ethos, and the way these things are produced, typically. And I think we are not that. The way we did this is kind of the norm still in the industry. So I mentioned values, and I think that's another important thing that needs more attention in these types of projects. So, whose values are encoded in these systems? Whose interests do they serve? You know, where do they come from? So we did kind of try to uncover shared values in the organization through our early stage kind of field research, interviews, that sort of thing. Kind of borrowing techniques from from user-centered design. But I think again the typical agency-client relationship in the commercial context kind of constrain us in various ways, and I think we can do better if we have kind of this toolbox. So I'm aware of value-centered design, for example, but I haven't seen any examples of value-centered design within within this type of project. I would be interested to see it. So this would be taking value seriously and going into the project with no fixed values attached to it, but really kind of surfacing them and then kind of building games that would kind of convey them in some way. And this pairs nicely, of course, with kind of the collaborative or participatory design approach. But again, this value-sensitive design has been around for quite a while. As far as I'm aware, in the industry, this hasn't been widely adopted. And again, I wonder, why is that? Both games, like I mentioned, borrow heavily from resource management board games, and these tend to have some mechanical complexity. We considered that necessary at the time to create a kind of a sense of realism, but also to kind of create enough complexity for interesting behavior and interesting kind of challenges to emerge that would then kind of feed into this kind of social negotiation around these games. In part inspired by this awesome essay by game designer and musician David Kaniga, I've become super interested in this notion of kind of games as software toys. So we tend to think games are rules-based systems, but he argues that all electronic or video games are toys with affordances and rules as such are, he reframes as social allowances around physical artifacts. And so video games have none of that, so they are actually purely toys, whereas a board game actually needs a kind of social allowances layer to operate. So taking that kind of idea as a starting point, I would be interested in pushing even more of the substance of a game into that kind of layer of social allowances. And so simplifying the artifact, or kind of making them mechanically less rigid, maybe is the right word, which would potentially allow for kind of a spontaneous renegotiation of the game by the players. Whereas these games that I just showed, Code 4 and Ripple Effect, have a much much higher complexity. And that would also again kind of allow players to kind of adapt the game to their own needs. So it all kind of connects back to those previous points I just made. Okay, I need to wrap up. Just two more slides. Some final thoughts. So Ripple Effect in particular focuses quite heavily on competence, on mastering this game system. So it's kind of firmly in kind of the gameful design spectrum in my view. Code 4, because it has this kind of social layer around it and this role play aspect around it, and just a more emphasis on social interaction. There's it also kind of balances the competence aspect more with kind of a sense of autonomy, I think. And in Ripple Effect, there's just less play around the core game. And it seems to me, within the context of workplace change management, that mastering this subjective simulation is maybe not the best way, not necessarily the best way of learning about what makes for a good way of collaborating with colleagues and so on and so forth. That was the premise for, when we did this project going in. I would seriously consider otherwise at this point in time in my career. Okay, and finally, the problem with the agency model that we operated in also was that we could not stick around for the long haul. It's a project-based kind of model of collaboration. So we would create these games, deliver them, maybe do some QA, some quality assurance, and supporting the game for over the course of a year or something. But much more than that, you can't really afford as a boutique agency in this context. And anyway, that's not the expectation also in the industry. But the problem is that you can then not really kind of stick around to see how these games are used in the long run. I'm sure some of you have questions about that for me. I can't really answer them, and I think that's a terrible shame. So in this book, Stuart Brand argues for something similar for architects to kind of revisit the buildings that they designed to see how they are used by its occupants, and importantly also how they are adapted by its occupants. And he makes his whole case for kind of adaptive design, that a good building is a building that people can kind of physically adapt to their needs as well. And I'm inclined to think that there's something there for these workplace games as well. So what would a workplace game look like that can be physically adapted by its players in the workplace? And that's where I will leave it. Thank you very much.